So I would not know, but I'm sure it cannot be easy to be a professional musician. You know, you work really hard, you craft something, and then you put it out to the world, and then you await the response, and you wait for the potential criticism. I mean, it can be challenging to be a pastor and preach sermons, yes, but I don't have to worry about waking up on Monday and having 5 different websites rate my sermon on a scale from 1 to 10. Please don't start a website like that. And, you know, because I'm getting older and I would say a little bit out of touch, I will sometimes peruse these musical websites to try to find new things to listen to. And some of the reviews I've learned can be really harsh when you read them. And I've learned that one of the worst insults that you can kind of hoist upon a musician is that they have sold out. Now, what does it mean when a musician sells out? Well, it can mean a couple different things, but generally speaking, it refers to a musician or a band that decides to change their musical style in order to sell more records, in order to make more money. And so you've got a band that decides that, you know, they're done with playing the small clubs. They don't want to just get by anymore. They want to do something and do what it takes to appeal to a mass audience. Now, some of you may be familiar with a band called the Velvet Underground. They were a pretty artistic band in the late 60s and early 70s. And when they were first starting out, they had this drummer, and his name was Angus MacLeese. And Angus MacLeese was absolutely determined that he was not going to be a sellout. But this became a problem for Angus and the band because part of what it meant to him to be a sellout was that he was not going to show up when he was told, and he was not going to play his drums when he was supposed to. He would show up to shows sometimes hours late, sometimes a few days late, because if he showed up when everyone else did, it wouldn't really be art as he understood it. So just imagine like Jim Waldron showing up on Tuesday and playing his trumpet parts and then just leaving with nobody here. That's what Angus would do. But the deal breaker came for Angus when the band was offered $75 to play in a high school auditorium. And the band decided to take the gig, and Angus said, "I'm done." He abruptly quit the band over $75. He was not going to have his vision co-opted by anyone or anything else. Angus was not going to be a sellout. Now, Angus is probably an extreme example. You probably wouldn't encourage a budding musician to be like him. But I think his story does resonate with people in part because we want to think of ourselves as the type of people that are bound by integrity more than we are bound by popularity. Bound by integrity more than we are by the approval of others. So in short, we don't exactly want to be like Angus, but we also don't want to be sellouts, right? Well, today we're continuing in our series in the Gospel of John, and we're picking up in chapter 7, which is going to involve a shift in scenery. In fact, our passage today takes place in 2 separate areas. First, in the region of Galilee, and then in the region of Judea, and more specifically in Jerusalem. Recently, we've seen Jesus doing some really impressive signs, he walking on water, providing food for thousands of people. But today we're going to see Jesus deal with people who either didn't understand him or just didn't like him. In fact, today we're going to hear that there are people ready to kill Jesus. And we're going to see that part of the reason why this happened was because Jesus wasn't worried about the expectations or the agendas that other people would put on him. See, Jesus didn't come to earth to just go along with what other people said or thought. And in speaking and in living in this way, Jesus is going to challenge all sorts of different people. And I believe that today he will challenge us and hopefully also encourage us as we hear this account from John. Because we can be encouraged when we see what Jesus went through for people like us. And we'll hopefully also be challenged when we hear the way that he goes about it. So our passage is really broken up into 3 brief parts. And so we start with verses 1 to 9, and we see what happens when Jesus is still in Galilee. So let me read that section again. It says, "After this, Jesus went about in Galilee. He would not go about in Judea because the Jews were seeking to kill him. Now the Jews' feast of booths was at hand. So his brothers said to him, 'Leave here and go to Judea, that your disciples also may see the works you are doing. For no one works in secret if he seeks to be known openly. If you do these things, show yourself to the world.' For not even his brothers believed in him. Jesus said to them, 'My time has not yet come, but your time is always here. The world cannot hate you, but it hates me because I testify about it that its works are evil. You go up to the feast. I am not going up to this feast, for my time has not yet fully come.' After saying this, he remained in Galilee." So these verses kind of set the scene for the rest of the passage. But there's a lot here, just in these verses, I think, to think about. The last big event that John told us about was the feeding of the 5,000. And it seems like we're picking back up here about 6 months later. There are plenty of things that happened in those 6 months, but as John tells us later in the book, his goal wasn't to tell us every single thing that Jesus did, because that would have taken forever. But one thing John does tell us is that Jesus has to watch where he goes. Judea is a dangerous place for Jesus to be because there are people there that want to kill him. And so he's been staying in Galilee. Galilee was further to the north, and Judea, where Jerusalem was, further to the south. And so Jesus has been keeping to the north. And even in this, I think we see some of the humility of Jesus. We believe that Jesus is the creator of all things. We believe that he created the whole universe. And yet not only does he humble himself and come to this earth as a human being, but then he actually restricts himself to certain areas because people that he created, people that he gave life and breath to, people that he is sustaining, are threatening to take his life away. And this is relevant for many reasons, but in part because there's an important gathering coming up in Judea. It's the Feast of Booths. Now, there were multiple feasts that the Jews of this time celebrated, and there were 3 separate annual feasts that brought the Israelites to Jerusalem. But the Feast of Booths, that was like the biggest party out of all of them. I mean, you did not want to miss the Feast of Booths. It was quite a celebration. The Feast of Booths did a few things. It helped the Israelites to remember the time when they lived in the wilderness after God delivered them out of slavery in Egypt. And it also was a time for them to give thanks to God after the harvest season. And so the Feast of Booths was a time of thanksgiving, but the Feast of Booths was also a time of joyfully looking forward, because it was looking forward to another time when God would again deliver his people. Because remember, the Jewish people of that time are living under Roman rule, and they very much look forward to being delivered again. And so the Feast of Booths was a great time for everyone. And to Jesus' brothers, it seemed like a great time for him to make kind of a big appearance. They've been around Jesus. They know the amazing things, the works that he can do, feeding thousands of people, healing people, and so on. And they think that it's time for Jesus to go do these things under the bright lights of Jerusalem at the Feast of Booths. And so they tell him, you know what, get out of here. Get out of this Galilee area that no one really pays a lot of attention to and go to Jerusalem so that everyone can see all this amazing stuff that you're doing. And they sum it up to him by saying, for no one works in secret if he seeks to be known openly. If you do these things, show yourself to the world. Now, a few years ago, Catherine and I watched a movie called The Founder. Some of you may have seen this. It was the story of how McDonald's restaurants got their start. And some of you know the history, but McDonald's started in California as a single restaurant. And the owners really, that was their vision. They just wanted to have one restaurant and do it really well. Then there was this traveling salesman. His name was Ray Kroc. And he happened upon this solitary restaurant, and he realized that there was the potential there for something much bigger. And so in the beginning of the movie, he's begging and cajoling the owners of the restaurant until they finally agree, against their better judgment, to open other McDonald's restaurants around the country. And the movie, the rest of it really is a sad story about how this decision ends up blowing up in their faces. Someone with an outside agenda came in and wore down those original owners of McDonald's, and eventually they regretted it. And Jesus is faced with something similar here with, of course, much higher stakes. He has some people, in this case, his brothers, who are kind of pushing their agenda on him. But Jesus knows something about his brothers. He knows that his brothers don't believe in him at this point of their lives. Now, we need to be clear, his brothers believe things about him. They believe that he can do amazing and powerful things. It's not that they're doubting this. Their unbelief is of a different sort. It's that they don't understand what he has come to earth to do. They don't understand that he hasn't come to just kind of, get famous and build some sort of worldly kingdom so that he can get rich and they can all get rich with him. His brothers don't believe in him because they see Jesus the way that they want to see him. Their desires are thought to be his desires. Their agenda is thought to be his agenda. And of course, that's a temptation all throughout time, right? It's a temptation for us as well. We're very much drawn to projecting our desires onto Jesus, onto God, and claiming that our agenda is his agenda. Human beings can be prone to assuming that what we want is absolutely what Jesus wants. And what makes it really tricky is that it's almost impossible not to come to God's word without preconceptions about what it is going to say about issues that we care about. There's an author named Jonathan Haidt, an author. He talked about this when he said, we don't really arrive at our moral stances typically after a lot of moral reasoning. He points out that generally speaking, our moral intuitions and our moral stances actually come first, and then only after that does our moral reasoning kind of crank up. We tend to quickly settle on our morals and then backfill the reasons. And so this is what happens. Apart from the grace of God, once we find a certain narrative or once we find a certain moral stance attractive, as human beings, we're then prone to come up with reasons why that narrative or stance is right. And then we can be blind to or dismissive of reasons why that might actually be wrong. Happens in all sorts of areas, happens to all of us, happens to me, happens to you. And it can even happen when we come to the Bible. But the answer to this problem isn't to give up on trying to understand Jesus and his mission. The answer is that we approach Jesus and his word with humility and always be open to the fact that his narrative and his agenda might not always match ours. To be open to the fact that at some point, even if you're a Christian for a very long time, Jesus is going to say things, speak into your life that upset the apple cart of your moral framework or your theological framework or your political framework or many other frameworks, just to name a few. And we'll come back to that, but for now, notice how Jesus responds. He's not going to be shaped by his brother's agenda. That's why he says his time hasn't yet come. He's not saying, the ultimate time, that this is exactly the time he's going to go up to Jerusalem and die on the cross. He's saying this is not the time for me to go to this feast. Because it matters when Jesus goes up to the feast. Because Jesus is who he is. Every move that he makes, every trip that he takes is extremely important and fused with deep meaning. And some scholars think he's actually kind of humbling his brothers by saying, look, for you guys, any time is right. He's kind of reminding them of his own significance and that he's not going to be bound by their expectations. And he goes on to say that the brothers can go up anytime because nothing that they say and nothing that they do is going to have them run afoul of the crowds or the authorities. No one is trying to hunt down Jesus' brothers to kill them. But people are trying to kill Jesus because, as we've said, he is saying things that are not fitting with everyone's existing agenda. He's not afraid to call something evil that other people might call good. And so the brothers of Jesus depart for the feast without him while Jesus stays behind in Galilee. Now, as we said earlier, this passage has two locations, Galilee and Judea. And verses 10 to 13 kind of serve as the bridge. In the first 9 verses, Jesus is kind of confronted by his brothers, but by the end of our passage, Jesus is confronted by the crowds and the religious leaders. And these verses here in the middle, they kind of get us from here to there. So let me start in verse 10. It says, but after his brothers had gone up to the feast, then he also went up, not publicly, but in private. The Jews were looking for him at the feast and saying, where is he? And there was much muttering about him among the people. While some said, he is a good man, others said, no, he is leading the people astray. Yet for fear of the Jews, no one spoke openly of him. And so we start with a little bit of a curveball, because it seems like Jesus has said he's not going to the feast, but then after his brothers go to the feast, he also goes just in private. And it's easy to read these verses and wonder, is Jesus deceiving his brothers here? In fact, we were talking about this passage at the men's study on Tuesday morning, and Max pointed out that there's a famous atheist who, this verse is on his list of reasons that he's not a Christian, doesn't trust the Bible, and doesn't trust Jesus. Because clearly he says Jesus is lying here. But this is where I think our earlier interpretation is so important. It's important for us to see that when Jesus says the time hasn't come for him to go to the feast, he's literally saying, this is not the right time for me to go. The Greek word actually bears that out. It gets a little bit lost in translation, but that's what Jesus means. It's not time yet for me to go to the feast. And that actually makes a lot of sense when you think about it and also when you consider the character of Jesus. Jesus is going to go to the feast, but he's not going to go on someone else's terms. He's going on his own terms at his own time. And so Jesus has not lied to his brothers. He has in so many words said, you guys go ahead. It's not time for me to go yet. But the time would come. And by going up privately, we get another sense about how isolated Jesus is really becoming at this point in our narrative in John. Remember the passage last week that Max preached. So many of his so-called disciples had left him. And now his own family, his brothers, have misunderstood him, which is an incredibly isolating thing to experience. And now here he is going to kind of the biggest celebration of the year, a joyful and festive time. But where everyone else is traveling up in groups with joy and excitement, they can't wait to get there and celebrate, he's going quietly. He's going by himself. Some of you know what it feels like to be abandoned. Some of you know what it feels like to be so misunderstood that you feel alone. Jesus knows that feeling because he has experienced that feeling now and, of course, later on in his life. But on the other hand, by going up in private, Jesus stays in control of what he has come to do. And he's also able to avoid those who want to kill him, at least for a little bit. Because even if Jesus isn't immediately at the feast, he's kind of there because he's very much on everyone's minds. He's the topic of conversation. He's not really there, but he's kind of there because everyone is talking about him. And it says the Jews. Now the Jews, that's the phrase that the author of John, the Gospel of John, typically uses to refer to the Jewish leaders. And so these leaders are looking for him. But there's also plenty of non-leaders there, and they're talking about him too. And they're saying different things, right? Some think highly of him. Others say, you know what? No, he's a false teacher. And I think we all kind of do this on some level, right? Because notice that people are saying lots of things, but no one is speaking too loudly because the stakes are getting higher and higher. If you ever worked in an office, you know how people talk in the break room or when they're out to lunch compared to how they talk in the boardroom. And that's a little bit what's happening here. This isn't Galilee, this is Jerusalem, and there's powerful people all around. And because of the fear of these powerful people, because the stakes were getting higher and higher, no one is speaking openly. In Galilee, it was Jesus' brothers who tried to set the agenda. In Jerusalem, it's the Jewish leaders who are very much used to being the ones who set the agenda. And of course, as we've seen, Jesus is not living by everyone else's agenda, which causes tension. And so while others are not speaking up, he is. And we see this in verses 14 to 24. It says, about the middle of the feast, Jesus went up into the temple and began teaching. The Jews therefore marveled, saying, how is it that this man has learning when he has never studied? So Jesus answered them, my teaching is not mine, but his who sent me. If anyone's will is to do God's will, he will know whether the teaching is from God or whether I am speaking on my own authority. The one who speaks on his own authority seeks his own glory, but the one who seeks the glory of him who sent him is true, and in him there is no falsehood. Has not Moses given you the law? Yet none of you keeps the law. Why do you seek to kill me? The crowd answered, you have a demon. Who is seeking to kill you? Jesus answered them, I did one work, and you all marvel at it. Moses gave you circumcision, not that it is from Moses, but from the fathers, and you circumcise a man on the Sabbath. If on the Sabbath a man receives circumcision, so that the law of Moses may not be broken, are you angry with me? Because on the Sabbath I made a man's whole body well? Do not judge by appearances, but judge with right judgment. And so the time has come for Jesus to arrive at the celebration, to arrive on the scene. But notice again that it's on his terms. One of the guys at Bible study pointed this out. He shows up and he's not doing the signs that his brothers wanted him to do. He's actually teaching. And of course, teaching is one thing. Lots of people teach, but what Jesus is doing here is unique. See, the way it usually worked for someone to teach in this way at the temple is that they start studying at a young age with one of the leading rabbis, and they kind of come up through the system, and then eventually they're allowed and ready to teach. You have to go through a certain process, right? But Jesus didn't do any of this, and as a result, everyone is marveling at him. If Jesus didn't come up through those channels, through the establishment, how in the world is he able to teach like this? Of course, it's because Jesus wasn't simply at the temple to repeat what he has heard from another human rabbi. And he tells them why he is unique. And he asserts to the Jewish leaders that he is not bound by their ideas or by their authority. He's unique because his teaching is directly from the one who sent him, God the Father. As he said earlier in John, whatever the Father does, he does. And as he will say later in the book of John, he and the Father are one. And so he is completely qualified to teach, more so than anyone else, even though he didn't come up in that usual way. And the interesting thing is that Jesus doesn't just leave it at defending himself from the challenge of the Jewish leaders. He keeps going. Now, when I became a pastor in our denomination, I had to take a bunch of written exams, and then I had to be orally examined by 8 other pastors, 8 or so. And then I had to be examined again by a much larger group of pastors. And then they had some questions about one of my answers, and I had to go back again and answer some more questions, right? Typical process. They would ask me the questions, and I would answer. You know what I wasn't allowed to do? Turn their questions around on them. I couldn't be like, well, what do you think about that? That would not have gone well. I was there to be challenged, not to challenge them, and that was appropriate. That was good. And this is what the Jewish leaders were probably thinking here, right? That it was their place to do the challenging and the place of Jesus to do the defending. But he turns it around on them, doesn't he? After claiming that his teaching is from the Father, he tells them, look, if someone's will is to do the will of God, they will know the truth about me. Basically, they will know that my words are God's words. And Jesus asserts that he is there to honor and glorify God the Father, and that what he is saying is true. In him, in Jesus, there is no falsehood. It's a challenge to them. Now, earlier, I said that truly receiving God's word at times can be hard for all of us, because we often come with our preconceived agendas. We're often tempted to merely seek approval for what we already believe and love and hold dear. And that's what makes Jesus, what makes what he says so important. Truly receiving God's word, he says, is not just a matter of intellectually knowing it better, as important and as good as that is. One author said it this way about this passage. He said, recognizing the truth of Jesus' teaching is not dependent upon intellectual ability or formal learning, nor is it a reward for the noble search for truth. It depends rather upon a person's willingness to do the will of God. The impediments to knowing the truth about God are more likely to be moral than anything else. I had a seminary professor who put it this way. He said, it starts with your posture. Learn and learn and learn some more, but do it all with a posture of humility and a willingness to have Jesus challenge you when you meet him in his word. Because if we don't, the blind spots that we kind of naturally have are only going to grow. And I've mentioned it before, but someone actually wrote a book. It was so helpful, called Blind Spots. And notice that speaking generally, and I'm not trying to put anyone in a box, so don't feel like you have to be in one of these categories exclusively, but typically there are three kinds of proclivities that Christians and churches have. You have the commissioned Christians, right? And they read the Bible primarily through the lens of the mission that Jesus has for us, and they tend to be really creative, they tend to be really innovative, they tend to be really practical. Then there are the compassionate Christians who read the Bible through the lens of caring for others, and they tend to be really generous and empathetic and sensitive. And then there are the courageous Christians who read the Bible through the lens of a truth to be defended, and they tend to be steadfast and learned and bold. And look, those are all good things. I'm not saying one's bad, no. Those are all very good things, but we need to see that Jesus, for all three groups at times, he's going to affirm us, but he's also going to challenge us, especially in the areas where we tend not to automatically gravitate to. And if you think about it, a lot of times the courageous ones aren't the most compassionate. The compassionate ones aren't the most courageous. And so Jesus is going to challenge us when we come to him in his word. As one author has said, we're not just brains on sticks as human beings because we love. We love certain things. And because we are still sinners, not all of those loves line up with what Jesus loves and what he wants us to love. And so when we come to his word, we want to humbly ask him to help us to desire to really know him and want to do his will. And that's a prayer that he answers because he loves us. And this is where he challenges the Jewish leaders. He says, has not Moses given you the law? He's saying, look, no one is questioning that on one level you know the law inside and out, but do you know it? Has it taken a hold of you? And apparently it is not. Because as Jesus points out, none of them are keeping the law because here they are wanting to kill Jesus. Obviously a clear violation of the law. Now the crowd, the larger crowd, they might be confused by this because they might not know of the leader's plot to kill Jesus. And so they simply accuse Jesus of having a demon. To them, that's the best explanation for what's happening. Just as Jesus' brothers have misunderstood him, now he's being misunderstood again, and of course in a much graver way. But Jesus takes them back to the root of their whole disagreement. Back in John chapter 5, when Jesus healed a man on the Sabbath. You remember Max preached on that some time back. That was the thing that really upset the Jewish leaders. You weren't supposed to do most kinds of work on the Sabbath, and the leaders thought that what Jesus did violated that commandment from God. But Jesus turns it on them. He says, look, you want to kill me for healing a man on the Sabbath, but let's talk about circumcision. See, circumcision, just like the Sabbath, came down to them through Moses, although Jesus notes that circumcision was actually around before Moses. Some of you know it started with a man named Abraham who lived sometime before Moses. Jewish boys were supposed to be circumcised on the 8th day after their birth. And sometimes this fell on the Sabbath. And the Jewish leaders, they believed that the law to circumcise outweighed the Sabbath law, and therefore they would circumcise on the Sabbath. Now, Jesus does not say that circumcision is unimportant, but he says, look, what I did on the Sabbath is even more important. Not just circumcising, one part of a man's body, but making his whole body well. And the Jewish leaders, because they're the leaders, they should have the insight to see that this was a good thing. But they don't have this insight. Why? Because they were blind to it. Because the leaders loved what they loved. They loved defending what they saw as the truth. They loved their own power. They loved their own way of life. And even though on one level they knew the law inside out, they weren't able to judge Jesus correctly. It's the same problem that Jesus' brothers had. Jesus didn't fit their agenda, and therefore they couldn't see clearly to understand who he was. And Jesus calls them out on it, saying, do not judge by appearances, but judge with right judgment. Of course, this is much easier said than done, and that is why we need Jesus to work. It's interesting that Jesus brings up circumcision here, because circumcision was always supposed to be about more than circumcision. Jesus points out that what he has done is greater than circumcision, because he's made a man's whole body well. But in the midst of the Old Testament, we find out that the physical circumcision that the Jewish people experienced was pointing them to something much greater, to a circumcision of the heart, where people would not just be outwardly changed according to appearances, but inwardly changed in the depth of their being. And as we keep going through the book of John, we're going to see how Jesus accomplishes this amazing and great work. He's going to continue to teach, yes, but he's also going to eventually return to Judea less than a year after this Feast of Booths. And this time when he comes, he won't come in secret. It'll be a big entrance. And this time, those that want to kill him will get what they want. And he will go to a cross and be killed. And why did he do this? Because it was his agenda. Not his disciples, not his brothers, not the Jewish leaders. His agenda, his mission, given to him by his Father, to die for the sins of many who misunderstood him, to die for the sins of many of those who were once his enemies, to die to end the suffering of those who experience some of the loneliness that he experienced, to die to end the suffering of those who experience the isolation of being misunderstood by those that they love. A mission to reclaim a sinful and suffering people for himself. And after he dies, he's resurrected. And after he's resurrected, he gives his people the Holy Spirit. And it's through this gift of the Holy Spirit that we are indeed changed. Again, not according to appearances, but on the inside and the depth of our being. And part of that change is that we see that there is no other power in this world, no other person or movement or thing in this world that is worth our ultimate allegiance. Every other kingdom and power will end, but the kingdom of Jesus goes on forever. It's interesting. Circumcision was one of the signs that God gave his people in the Old Testament, but in the New Testament, one of the signs we are given, and one of the ways that God sustains and builds us up as we wait for Jesus to return someday, is the Lord's table. And there's an author named Russell Moore who put it so well. He said, as we gather together around the table, we are being trained to eat at the big table in Jerusalem. And we're announcing to ourselves and to the satanic powers in the air around us what's really true. Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die, is a sham. But the alternative is not a refusal to eat, drink, or be merry. That would be ingratitude. Instead, with the resurrected Jesus, we sing out, let us eat, drink, and be merry, for yesterday we were dead. The kingdom of Jesus is a kingdom worth living for. It's a kingdom worth our ultimate love and our ultimate allegiance, because it belongs to him.